In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captives how to fight.
Guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Ama verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cried Candide, I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
She was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
Hi, welcome now to lesson 19, and we have very few left. Hope you recognize me with my new do. But the same old jacket you'll see, so you should be able to recognize me. We moved today to Flaubert, from Faust, from Goethe's Faust, and the movement from Goethe to Flaubert is the movement from Romanticism to Realism, which becomes one of the dominant literary, I don't want to call it a form, but one of the dominant literary and artistic movements of the 19th century. Your text gives you a very good introduction on realism, and I'm not going to bore you with all of the details of realism, but some of them you can infer from Madame Bovary, and we can talk about those perhaps later. The question for us is, are we going to call him Charles or Charles? Are we going to, is it going to be Madame Bovary, or is it going to be Madame Bovary? Whatever you're comfortable with is fine. I don't think Flaubert would have minded. So let's start with questions or observations about the novel, about Madame Bovary. Did you like reading the novel? Good novel?
It was good to get in the mind of a woman.
Yes.
And I think he really defined Madame Bovary very well for us, her emotional state, her dreams.
Yes, he does get into, this is one of the things that realism does. With, in the 19th century, you're going to see a tremendous increase in studying the psychology of characters, not so much looking at the action and the consequence of the action, but the author trying to see what created the action. The naturalists will go so far as to use a kind of pseudo-scientific method going back to environment and heredity and things like that in attempting to understand character. Yeah, one of the joys of this novel, for some it's a frustration, is the way he portrays the inner landscape as well as the outer landscape of his character. And he does that through Emma, and he does it through point of view, I think, rather remarkably, and it's worth our talking about that in the first hour. I once taught an honors section of a world literature since the Renaissance class, very bright students. They got to Madame Bovary, and one of the students, in great exasperation, pounded the seminar table and said, "I hate this novel, I hate this novel." And I thought, what kind of strange being could this be who would hate a novel like this? I said, why? He says, "Nothing ever happens. All she does is think." I thought that was remarkable. My first reaction was tremendous frustration. I thought, by God, what a stupid thing to say. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized he's really quite right. The novels before Flaubert gave you lots of incident, lots of events. Flaubert really slows the movement of the novel down, slows the action down considerably, and that's one of his contributions to the novel form.
I think the contrast is so interesting. I mean, it just hits you in the eye. From the things that we have read, things happen.
Yes.
And here we learn about the character's background and what makes them act the way they do.
Yes.
It's the psychology that we're getting now that we didn't get before.
Precisely.
And the stream of consciousness and the thought, which we didn't get before.
Precisely true. That's the point I was trying to make earlier, and you're absolutely right. If you look back to where we've come from, you can see so much of the focus is on the action and then the consequence of the action, but not so much at all on what causes the action, what motivates the action. Indeed, that's a real slippery area, isn't it, when you get into motivation.
We've
Susan?
still been able to see that they ended up, the story went the way it did, and they did what they did because of who they are.
Yes.
But then to add the dimension of being able to watch the mind work,
That's what
that
the point
really
of
is
view. Yeah,
interesting.
that is fun. That's what the point of view gives us in
Yeah.
this novel.
But it makes it, I thought it was one of the saddest ones.
Really?
to
Yeah.
read.
Why?
Yeah. Well, because she did have a husband who loved her and who thought
Yes.
she loved him, and she had a little daughter, and it seems like in one way you'd look at her and a lot of people probably thought she had everything. He thought she had everything. Well, and I guess she did, but a lot differently than what he thought. It just, I don't know.
Yeah, I do know. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah,
The ending is not exactly uplifting, is it?
No, but they
and that's
really did connect. They had two entirely different views of a relationship that they were both participating in,
Yeah.
and that. But they talked to no one, especially each other.
a lot of I want to return to that because I think you're making a very good point about the ending and about the note of sadness that's in the novel. You're going to see that increasingly in the 19th century, a real darkening of mood especially in fiction, a real darkening of mood, and I want to talk about that, why that's happening. Yeah.
You were saying you felt sad about it, and I felt really sad about it too, because in my own amateur psychologist looking into her,
Yeah.
I said she's a manic depressive.
Oh,
because
yes,
she's these
the
frenzied
peaks and
times,
valleys, yes.
and then this deep depression, and I know personally two people that have suffered this, and there's really no solution usually except medication, which wouldn't have been available at that time.
Right.
And she was in a trap,
Right.
if that's truly what it was.
Well, it's interesting that you'd use the disease metaphor in a sense. Did we not talk about this before? If not, forgive me, I just celebrated a birthday. You don't celebrate them, do you? You observe them at this point. And the synapses are they're going very fast here. But the metaphor changes, doesn't it, from sinfulness to disease. Those things that you used to burn somebody at the stake for, or you would explain as a kind of devil possession. In the 19th century, with the rise of science, the 19th century sees the real rise of science, a real change in how human beings look both at themselves and at the world. That metaphor starts to shift into disease. Not yet, though, by the time of Flaubert. You'll notice that,
I know.
yeah, Flaubert doesn't have a label for
any
any
of
of
it.
it.
If it
Yeah.
had been written, that would have been.
Yeah.
My question is, are we going to concentrate on Emma? I felt sorry for Charles.
Yeah.
I felt so sorry from the day that he went to school and he was picked on. He had "kick me" written all over him.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
He wasn't sure of his own abilities. He couldn't test himself because he wasn't sure what his limits what they might be. And as we get farther, almost to the end, and we discover how all these people are still going to the pharmacist who has no qualifications instead of him, he won't be missed. She didn't miss him when she chose someone else. I just felt that his character was a very strongly built one.
Good observation.
And a victim from the word go.
Yeah, it's a good observation. And we will indeed talk about Charles.
Good.
Yeah. You'll notice that the novel uses the framing device of Charles. You may have wondered as you began the novel, now wait a minute, this is about Madame Bovary, if you're coming at it for the first time. And the first Madame Bovary you discover is really not the Madame Bovary you think she's going to be, is it? It's Charles' first wife, who is really quite different. We have a very slow opening, told by a narrator who uses a plural first-person point of view. He talks about we. Remember, he seems to be in the classroom with Charles when Charles makes his first entry, and then that we disappears in the first section. The point of view shifts imperceptibly. I almost dare any of you to point in the text where it happens. It just kind of happens seamlessly. It's really beautifully done. And we begin and end with Charles. And yeah, well, it may be. Good for you, it may be. I have heard that argued, that it's every bit as much Charles's story as it is Emma's story. I have a bit of a hard time with that, but he is foregrounded, to be sure. Right. And we want to ask ourselves, I think, look at his fate. Look at what happens to him. It really is awful. He's despoiled on any number of levels. Certainly Emma's adulteries become evident to him at the end, and they essentially crush him. He's crushed financially, and of course his professional reputation is stolen from him. So he's really ruined on 3 levels, and in each of those he's a kind of victim. But I want to be real careful about this victim stuff. I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here, because if we wish, of course, we can all be victims of everything, and I think we have to ultimately start questioning responsibility, especially in this novel. To what extent, in short, is Emma responsible for her fate, I think is a legitimate question to ask, because any number of people in the novel say fate willed it that way. Remember when she and Rudolph break up, it's fate. When Charles discovers things at the end, he says it was fate. Yes, it was destiny. Now, is that true or is that not? If it is true, what does it mean? You know, what is fate? What does it mean to be the victim of fate and of circumstances? These are legitimate and large questions, I think, that are typical of the 19th century novel.
Well, I think it's...
Wait, let me get Valeria first, and then I'll come over here.
Isn't Flaubert projecting his own romanticism on Emma? In the sense, he denigrates her to project the male ego onto Charles, his own ego. I'm talking about the author.
Yeah.
So he survives the whole thing.
Yeah.
But all the things that are in Flaubert's mind, he puts onto Emma.
Yeah, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh.
That has been argued, of course, that what he's doing is wrestling with his own romanticism and his own romantic nature. It's very hard. I get, you guys have asked me questions like this before, and I've always gotten very sheepish in the presence of questions like that, because I'm nervous about intention. The intentional fallacy, as it's known in literary criticism, is a fairly dangerous one. So I would say we don't know enough, but perhaps it's not just Flaubert who sees that in Emma and projects that in Emma. Perhaps it's all of us who do, and perhaps that's why we continue to read this novel. You'll remember the, from Faust, the two souls inhabit the breast idea. Remember from Goethe's Faust, the image, or the image of the grasshopper wanting to leap from the lawn and go into flight. Well, we're watching this, aren't we, in this novel? We're watching Emma, who, unlike everybody else in this provincial milieu, at least has a sense, has a subjunctive sense, that there's something beyond, who shall I use, Homais, petty, crass, cliched, stereotypical perception of life. So when she is destroyed by that, I would want to ask you, is that a criticism of Emma and her dreams, or is that a criticism of the bourgeoisie that crushes a person like Emma and crushes those kind of romantic dreams? That's not an easy question to deal with, is it? And all of us, I guess, from that point of view, may say, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Yeah, because we are all aware of that. Let's see, Susan and then Barbara?
Okay, well, Charles, you could almost say the same thing. He doesn't, he's the context, the major context in which she does these things.
Yes.
As far as her life. But he refuses to see any flaws in her without really connecting to her, and she refuses almost to see anything good in him. She's even irritated by his almost worship of her. But I think when you're talking about fate, I think that's the great cop-out. That's the modern way to say, I have no responsibility
Exactly,
for
well,
this.
precisely. That's right. And it's even interesting that in the novel, when Charles talks about fate, he uses passive voice. It's just, it's very different to say fate willed it that way than it is to say it was willed by fate. You hear the difference between active and passive voice. It's really quite dramatic. Yeah. You say you give them more will, I think, and more consciousness than I give them. When you say they chose not to do, or that's not exactly the word you used, but it was something like that. They chose not to see the weakness or something. I'm not sure he chose that.
Yeah, I was going to say especially Charles, but she was just as blind. She, they both were blind to each other.
Oh, sure. Everyone is. That's one of the. Again, one of the enduring themes of 19th century literature is you put people in groups and they cannot connect with one another. They cannot communicate to one another. Obviously, this has spilled into the 20th century. We'll see the great example of it, of course, in the last thing we read this term. When we read Metamorphosis, where the human being is turned into a giant insect, and there's a complete lack of
What
communication.
would you call it? Self-absorption, maybe?
Yes, that is certainly true of Emma, wouldn't you say? She really has a very hard time getting beyond the bounds of herself.
And then the fate of the daughter.
Oh, it's terrible.
Who is innocent. She truly is innocent victim of her accident of birth.
Yes, indeed. Yep. So we want to ask, let me complicate the waters again. Somebody's going to have to keep track. It's supposed to be me, but I'm so old now, I'm not sure I can do it. Keep track of all the questions that are floating here, but let me ask another one. If Emma is punished for her sins, let me just put it bluntly, during the course of this novel, if suffering is the consequence of sin and error, can we conclude that reward is the consequence of something good, of a positive value? And of course, you know where I'm going with this. And
how that follows in our book.
I leave you with Homais at the end, you know, who is awarded the Legion of Honor, you know, and you all look at that and go, oh my God, you know. So in short, if I'm looking for a morally coherent universe in this novel, I'm very hard pressed to find it. I see who suffers in the novel more than Charles, you know, and I ask you what he did to deserve what happened to him. Berta is going to be sold into essentially into slavery, you know. What did she do to deserve that fate, you know?
Well, Charles, though, I think, you know, do you think he felt suffering through most of his marriage to Emma? In the sense that he just worshipped the ground she walked on. Mm-hmm. And they said he was perfectly happy. He negated everything she did that might have put a ripple over his view of her as perfect, and just his beloved, who loved him too.
Yeah, you know, you're right. I mean, yes. Don't you all agree? I mean, he did. I mean, he saw her through what, you know, rose-colored glasses or whatever kind of. Yes. But what's important in that sentence, from my point of view, is that he saw her through glasses. And what I mean by that is, you'll notice that Flaubert, as the entire 19th and 20th century has done, rejects the notion of some kind of objective truth out there that we all should be pursuing and that we all can see. You'll notice in this novel, there really is no truth with a capital T. There are a series of perceptions. Each of the characters in the novel views the other characters and the world from a peculiar perspective. And so you're right. Charles views Emma in a way that, of course, we don't, because we see so much more clearly than Emma, because we're looking at Emma through Flaubert's consciousness. Charles doesn't have that. Yeah. So you get my point here, so that they're all looking at reality, whatever that strange word, reality, as if it's out there and something clear and objective that we all should be pursuing, which has been the ideal of Western culture since the Greeks, the notion that there is this objective reality out there. Science is starting to collapse this in the 19th century. We're starting to discover that the view of the bridge depends upon the perspective from which it is seen, you know? And it takes many, many, many perspectives to arrive at a complete picture. So yeah, Charles does have blinders on in a way, motivated by, I think so, you know, I think so. He's a real innocent, isn't he? He's an innocent. Now some of you will say he's stupid. I would agree, you know, he's limited, yes. He's dull, yes. He's commonplace, yes. He's unromantic, yes. He's unsentimental, yes to all of that. But he projects his innocence onto Emma. So when Emma comes back from the ride with Rudolph, and Rudolph offers the use of a horse so that she can ride again, Charles isn't threatened, you know. Of course she's not. Nothing's going to go on here, you know. Emma, you should take the horse. You should take the offer. And we shake our heads going, oh, how he does not see her. You know?
Even she at that point is saying, I don't think so.
Yeah.
The last one, I have nothing to wear.
Right.
Her husband kind of gave her, in a way.
To him.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure.
There's irony in the dialogue at that time. He says,
something about how I'd like to make my wife available to you for these rides. And then he says, and may I trust in your good services.
Yeah. And he certainly could.
Big time.
Yeah, big time is right.
There seems to be some similarities here to what I read in Madame Chatterley's Lovers several years ago.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
She goes off and
He got in, you know, Flaubert got in a lot of trouble for this, as you probably, although it was more a tempest in a teapot to, as hurling cliches out here left and right. It really didn't amount to a whole lot, but he was threatened. He was seen by many as a pornographer. The women in the provinces, however, that is, and the provinces, you must understand, is anything due east of Paris. You know, I mean, there's Paris, and then there's the rest of France, which is rather provincial. All the women in the country, all the women, excuse the overstatement, many women in the countryside wrote Flaubert letters saying, "How did you do this? How did you know?" Yeah, exactly. How did you know is exactly right. That they were out there living just the way Emma was, feeling the same sense of suffocation. And I use that term by design. I mean, at the end, if we have time, we'll talk about Flaubert's use of windows here in the novel. It's really quite wonderful. And she asks that the window be open, that she's suffocating. You know,
she's also portraying women as isolated beings. That's not a perception that's really so foreign to us.
That's correct.
Century.
Yeah, you're right.
And she's living in a man-dominated world. She lives with her father. She's not in the province. She isn't exposed to a number of suitors, and she makes a choice to settle for Charles. Her heart was not engaged particularly, although I remember, I think she describes him, him in not bad terms, but it was not enthusiastic. And I think she settled for this mate.
Yeah, I want to talk about this in the second hour. Your points, your points are very well taken, and I'm going to ask you in the second hour whether you think this is a feminist novel or not, and if it is, to what extent is it? There's lots of talk about that.
I don't know about that, but I just related to things all together. Earlier we talked about the mindset and how we got into this. To me, it was ponderous. I mean, anybody would think that slowly. I mean, I could imagine one of the other authors, who was it, Molière, that we read. Yeah. Now, what would he have done with this character? I thought.
Well, he deals with it. As long as you raise the point, let's make the analogy. I mean, clearly, what Molière, because of his gift for comedy, would have taken the inability, and he did, didn't he, in Tartuffe, took the inability of people to communicate to one another and made it a source of comedy. It's humorous when there's a kind of reciprocity of miscommunication. That becomes something rather funny. But your point, I think, is extremely well taken. When we move over into Madame Bovary, there's the isolation of the heroine here that makes for makes the miscommunication somewhat less than funny.
And they're both equally dull. To me. I mean, she sees herself as more broader, educated, and much brighter than she is, which most of us tend to do.
You're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, she does. Yeah.
And from that standpoint, she would even deem to look down on this man, and she's every bit as dull as he is. Her mind isn't that quick.
No, her mind. You're right. Her mind is not that quick. You're right.
I think part of the problem. I think is why she ends up the way she does.
Yeah. This is very good. You're right. I mean, she does think in terms of commonplaces.
Well, Rodolfo sized her up immediately.
Immediately. Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Wait. Initially, she was enthused about the idea of getting married to Charles.
We don't know. Let me be careful. Let me tell you that at the beginning we really don't know, and that's part of the charm of this novel, because those scenes at the farm are seen through Charles's perspective. Do you remember that? So when she goes up, when Emma goes up with her father to talk about the marriage proposal, remember a shutter was going to open as a signal to Charles. We're watching it from the outside. The novel's perspective has not come inside Emma's head yet. So we see Emma from Charles's point of view. We don't know what the conversation with the father was.
That's true.
We have no idea. We don't know what's going on in her head. What we do know, and Chad is right, of course, is what we do know, when the decision is made, she endorses it with a considerable amount of enthusiasm.
Yes.
But she does it always in terms of cliches. She wants a midnight torchlight wedding, remember? Yeah, she wants those things she read about in her romances.
My point is then she was enthused about the idea of Charles. I think the idea of getting married to Charles, but not Charles himself.
Yeah.
She had a certain perception of how marriage should be like, and she thought, oh, okay, this is what I'm going to be entering into. And so I think from the very beginning, it wasn't that she ever established some sort of relationship with Charles. She established a relationship with her idea of Charles.
Yeah.
And so...
No, but they did talk, Chad. And then the young man went there, you know, a lot, and they had talked. And as you got a little bit more at a time into Emma's mind, at least it seemed to me that Charles represented a lot of things she wanted. She wanted out of the farm.
I think
she wanted to live in a town. And he was kind, and he was interested in her. You know, I mean, I think, and then when they talk about the early days of the marriage, am I remembering that right?
You are indeed.
She went there quite happily, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
And she had plans for the house and this and that, but the thing is, as it went on, and she knew more about him as she was living her life in this town, and she began to appreciate how small it was, and began to see flaws in those things. And you're right, her dreams from her teenage novels and magazine articles that the one teacher used to sneak into the girls' school, and her fantasies.
Yeah, reality bumps up against her expectations.
She was more intrigued by her idea of Charles. She had a relationship with that idea as opposed to Charles as a person.
Yeah, you guys are not talking at cross purposes. You're both right. What you're saying is absolutely both correct. She is very much in love with the idea of marriage. But her expectations of marriage are quite romantic and indeed quite naive. And when the reality of the marriage finally sinks in, you get that wonderfully symbolic scene at the end of part one where she throws the wedding bouquet into the fire, the dried up. I mean, if you miss that, you're, you know, and woof, up it goes in flames as she leaves Toasties. It's even better done actually in the garden scene. Remember the garden that they have behind their house in Toasties, and they have the curé, the plaster curé, reading the breviary. Do you all know where I'm going with this? And it's beautifully clean. Yeah, and what happens to it within 30 pages of the novel?
And the face is all scarred.
Precisely. The ears come off. You got it. And then when they make the move from one town to the other, it's bounced right out of the carriage and smashes into a million pieces. I mean, it's just that kind of use of symbolism by Flaubert is everywhere in the novel.
Well, considering the time. Oh.
That's all right, Susan.
Okay, just don't you think it's interesting that they were married several years before they had a child, and at the time, wasn't that one of the things people really looked forward to, starting to have children? It was never mentioned.
Well, it's just never mentioned, is
right,
it? Yeah,
considering the two of them, maybe that's what made it normal, but I don't feel like that was normal for the time.
Well, they don't talk about it at all, so it's hard for me to, you know, to pursue it. What is touching, of course, is Emma's wanting a boy. That's very sad.
Because they're free.
Exactly. And even her, but I would even suggest to you that while she really feels that even that is stereotypical and cliched, all of her perceptions. She wants a man because a man has passions that can be expressed, whereas a woman can't, you know. Fascinating character. I'm getting a sign that we need to roll for the videotape. I went to Oxford, as you may know from other classes, and while we were there, we spoke to Alison Finch from Jesus College, Oxford, on Madame Bovary.
Let's talk about point of view. It really is important in this novel. This is, we begin with Charles.
Yes.
And we end with Charles.
Yes.
Emma is at the center, and yet the point of view floats way above all of these characters. We get a voice that is almost above everything. Talk briefly about that point of view in the novel. It's fascinating.
Well, I think one reason why we begin with Charles is for purposes of dramatic suspense. We know that the novel is going to be about a Madame Bovary, but she doesn't appear on the scene for quite some time, and even once she appears, we don't see into her head for some time. So it is, if you like, a time-honoured dramatic device, this starting with Charles, as well as perhaps a device to make us see just how ruthless Emma can be later on. I think the fact that we've started out sympathising with him makes us see how ruthless she's going to be. However, once we do start to see inside Emma's head, then a curious double bind in the style takes over, which is what makes for the richness of Madame Bovary and what indeed Flaubert is famous for, in that we see her thoughts, we see them clothed in a more beautiful language than she herself could possibly have used. And yet those thoughts are constantly undercut by irony. Even the prettiest of the pictures she makes for herself can't be thought of as having anything other than a second-hand beauty. Although, paradoxically, the style in which Flaubert writes about them is beautiful in an original way, but what he's talking about is a second-hand beauty when she fancies going off to the land where the lemon trees bloom and sort of thing. Often also in that style, that beautiful style that describes her second-hand fantasies, there is a biting, undercutting element, as when her thoughts go to the inn where Léon is staying. They're like the pigeons on the roof of the inn whose feet are dabbling in the gutters. So you suddenly move from these rather lovely pigeons to the feet in the muck. And that immediately reminds us of the other side of Emma's thoughts. So Flaubert is not visible in the work, as he himself said. He is not visible in the work, but he's present everywhere, shaping our reactions, shaping the mixed way that we respond to Emma's thoughts. But the irony is all important. He is a supremely ironic novelist. And that's one of the great sources of enjoyment of the novel, I would say. The irony creates a tonic feeling, gives the novel, paradoxically enough, a kind of zest, a feeling of exhilaration at seeing the lid lifted constantly on so many phony ways of thinking.
Is Madame Bovary a particularly modern novel? Is it contemporary?
In fact, one could see it as the work that really started modernism in all kinds of areas, but particularly, of course, the novel, in that with Madame Bovary, we have a slowing down of the plot, we have intensive patterning inside the novel, a deliberate attempt to set up symmetries, far more focus on metaphor and seeing things through metaphor than one had had in earlier 19th century novels, an internalizing of the action, and a stress on subjectivity, which again I think one can see in earlier novels, but not foregrounded in quite the same way. And one can see how all kinds of famous later novelists, people like Proust and Gide and the new novelists of the post-war period in France, owe a great deal to Flaubert. It's inconceivable that Proust could have written his novel if it hadn't been for Madame Bovary, I think. And he himself acknowledges his debt to Madame Bovary in a rather begrudging way sometimes, but he does, yes. At the same time, one still has to say that Madame Bovary is a 19th century novel. There's a great deal of attention paid to physical detail. You know, the role of environment is important, the influential effects of childhood reading, all of that one can perhaps see as belonging very much to a 19th century emphasis. But it's just that Flaubert treats it differently.
Madame Bovary has been considered the great French novel. Do you think it's a great novel?
Yes, I do think it's a great novel. Yes, I wouldn't perhaps want to put it way ahead of certain other great 19th century and 20th century French novels, but I think it's one of the world classics, there's no doubt about it. And it's, well, countless readers testify to that fact, yes.
Where does its greatness lie? Is that too vague a question?
No, not at all. I think it's in both the psychology, the creation of a most unusual character, because although in many ways Emma in herself is conventional, the creation of this particular kind of character is unique and original. And also it's a great novel for the style in which it's written. I think everybody who reads Madame Bovary, whether in translation or in the original, can't fail to be struck by that sheer mastery of language. It's exquisitely handled. So for those two reasons, I would say it's a great novel, yes. And a very provocative one. Sorry, go on.
That was Alison Finch, who is a member of Jesus College. I was talking to her in her husband's office at All Souls College, Oxford, where they have no students. What a remarkable college that is. The faculty writes books and deals with the occasional graduate student. I enjoyed talking with her very much. She was very articulate and right to the point in her answers. I thought really quite good. Yeah, Barbara?
Well, back to Emma. I see her as an unsatisfied in life, but a sensual person. Yes. And I think that these two sides of her are extremely important. To my mind, she's a person that can never be satisfied, no matter what.
I was going to ask you that.
Relationship that she is in. I mean, when she was at church, she enjoyed with the nuns. She liked the passion and the awesomeness of it, but she couldn't stand the discipline. Right. And in life too, I mean, when she couldn't have the wedding that she wanted, or she couldn't buy all the baby clothes that she wanted, she lost interest in the baby even before the baby was born a girl.
Yeah, it's hard to sympathize with Emma.
Yeah, and when we talk about lack of communication, I mean, I lay that on her shoulders more than Charles. I think that the marriage could have been much more if she was able to bring more to it, but she was turned off.
You've raised a lot of interesting points here. Let me ask, I'm curious to get a kind of group consensus here. Do you think Emma could be satisfied with another man? Can you imagine Emma in a different environment with a different man being happy?
I was a little annoyed with Flaubert. He was building up Leon. I think he genuinely loved her. And I thought she would have the affair with him. And then this false lover, Rudolph, right? She readily goes to him, and he, the author already gives you this prelude about, this rake and how he was going to seduce her. Oh, yeah. And she falls quickly into his arms, whereas this genuine love I think Leon felt for her is dismissed so quickly.
Well, he was such a child at the time, yeah.
The other thing is, don't you think that'll happen with two people who are inexperienced in a man who doesn't know that much about women and a woman who doesn't know that much about men. Yep. And the thing is, with Rodolfo, he knew women. Right. He was a man of great experience, and he knew just what to do. Yeah. And she was innocent at that point in those terms, and easy prey.
And it also makes us a little bit more sympathetic with Emma in the sense that she's been softened, if you will, for Rudolph's blow. You know what I mean? She's been set up with Léon.
That's where I feel too, because at the very end, when Léon left for Paris, she realized, oh wow, he did love me, gosh, and I let him go. So I think she became much more receptive to whoever should follow.
Yeah.
And it just
she really was softened for Rudolph, and I think we sympathize with her more. Had she fallen so quickly and so hard for Léon, we'd have distanced ourselves even more, I think, from Emma. Whereas he uses that episode to show us her dissatisfactions and to show her commonplaceness. There's no other way to say that. When she and Léon are talking about poetry and talking about nature and talking about art, it is one dull cliche after the next. I mean, they did, yes. That's no doubt. It's no wonder they found one another in this tiny little town, you know. And it's no wonder that they would feed off one another's stereotypes, you know.
And so they did each take something out of that relationship.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
They really did.
But you're dodging my question of whether she could be happy with another man. Yeah.
I don't think she could be happy with one single human man.
Yeah.
I think her dream encompassed so much more beyond one single individual.
Yeah.
She would constantly be looking for more.
So what's the lesson here that we should, I just want to stay with the idea. So what's the lesson here that we should lower our standards? We should not want romance because after all the world just crushes it. You all know romance doesn't last, right?
She was in love with love, not with any particular man. I mean, she wanted a renewed love all the time.
Yeah. She wants the passion, right?
She wanted them to go through these little, pardon me.
No, but don't you think that's common? Isn't this what Anne Morrow Lindbergh spoke about with the, what is it, what's the seashell that she used to represent the initial stages of a love relationship, a romantic love relationship, and that this is transient. That's life.
Right.
This doesn't last. But there are whole lots of people who believe this is what it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And when that fades,
and when it fails, it's a crisis.
they begin. The relationship is over for them. They don't realize, in many ways, it's just begun, in terms of relationship. And
see, what I want to get you to ultimately is whether you think this, whether as we read this novel, we are meant to judge Emma, or are we meant to understand Emma? Do you hear what I'm saying? You hear the difference I'm throwing out to you? Or whether we're to neither to judge nor to understand, but simply to observe this kind of woman.
well, let me finish my little point about the seashell. Was that the point about that is that there are plenty of people who go through life looking for one sunrise after another.
Sure.
And thinking, but yeah, this story is open for all of those.
So do you judge her? Let's start with that. Do you judge her?
No, I just think that, you know, when she certainly didn't come to a very good end, and she was cruel to so many people in her life. But if you think about her childhood, every person she came in contact with, the father thought she was wonderful. He says at one point, she's no good to me on the farm, and he can't ask her to do any of these things because she's too well educated. And then she goes at 13 to the nuns, and they think she's brilliant. Who is it who's always answering the priest's questions, you know, the hard ones? She's always doing that. They think she's wonderful. They take her down to the refectory. They do all kinds of special things for her. She encounters richer girls there who have these marvelous books that fill her head with all the historical tales that she has, the tales of nobility, of grandeur, of the kind of thing that the ball is going to conjure up in her mind. That's what she drinks in. She never drinks in reality, really. She's just, she feeds on her own fantasies. And then when she's back on the farm, this is an isolated little place to be.
Why are these fantasies, I gotta stop. Why are these fantasies so bad?
They're not.
I say they're not too. I think they're wonderful. They're the things that make life life.
Sure, that's right.
Good for Emma.
Yeah, and it was just too bad that she couldn't, you know, moderate them as life and reality, you know, in marriage and childbirth brought her to some realization of what this trip is all about.
Yeah, okay. And you've been trying to...
Yeah, because I get the impression this is a lady who hasn't tended her personal garden very well.
Okay, to use a Voltairean phrase? Yeah, right. Yeah.
All right, well, this is what this class is about, so here I am.
Yeah.
This lady is bankrupt somehow. Something's missing inside of her.
Yeah.
Therefore, I don't think any one of us who has a garden this ill-tended or missing something so whatever it is inside of us would find satisfaction anything around us. The satisfaction with our lives or our capacity to do so would come from within. Right. And she doesn't have that capacity. And I think it makes her person to be pitied. There was something else.
Yeah, no, that's very good.
I can't think about it, but if I kept my hand out.
Boy, when I see that sort of energy in you next time, I'm tapping into it. That was remarkable. Yeah, you're right. I mean, her garden is rank and unweeded, to use a Hamlet phrase.
I know what it is. And then Leon, though, he starts out with Emma, like you said, really, you wonder, again, but he grows beyond that. Emma never has the opportunity, or is that fair?
Yeah.
But she doesn't ever take advantage.
It's quite fair. Even if Emma, I mean, let's stay with your idea. Even if Emma came to some self-awareness in Yonville, and that's a leap, all right? That's a leap, right? But even if she came to some self-awareness in Yonville, where would she turn? What could she do? She turns to the parish priest in a moment of crisis. You didn't miss this, I know. He turns, right? She knows. Talk about self-awareness. She knows she's in a crisis here. She needs help. So she turns to what traditionally is the moral, intellectual, psychological center of the little village, the parish priest. A man of some education, usually a man of a little bit of sophistication anyway, by provincial standards. And what does she bump up against but a boob, all right? A boob, yes.
He's deaf and blind.
Yeah, precisely, right. So what else is she to do? Were she a man? Were she creative? She could probably transcend that milieu. But she's neither of those things. She is neither creative nor a man. What is she supposed to do?
Turn to her husband.
Turn to her husband, who sees nothing. Exactly.
Well, she
Peter?
did do one thing. She sought these things out of town. She went to Lyon, which was under a guise,
Right.
But that would have been one of the things she could have done if you were looking for, some way to break out of the small town atmosphere.
What she does, of course, is to run to the nearest city, and try. You got to understand. Well, I don't need to tell you guys this. From the end of the 18th century right on up to our present day, we have this theme. Well, first of all, we have a great movement into cities, and so you start to get this great tension between the city and the country. You know this from American literature and American mythos and culture very well, and we're starting to see it again in the 80s. The notion that the cities are evil, right? The cities are dangerous, sinful, terrible places, and we lead pure lives more in tune with the cycles of nature, where I'm from. You understand my point here. It's a rather romantic view. It's the dancing with wolves mentality. W.C. Fields used to make wonderful short films about this very thing. One of the great short films, A Fateful Glass of Beer. Has any of you ever seen this? It's not a fit night out for men or beasts. And he's the country boy who comes into the city. He's never been in a saloon before. He goes into a saloon. He has a glass of beer. Oh my God! Well, you can see what one of the things that Flaubert is doing in Madame Bovary is showing us the milieu within which Emma operates, and he does it in a way that nobody has really done it before. Setting becomes foreground. The story is not, if I ask you what this story is about, you may say Emma, but you realize as soon as you say that, your answer is incomplete, right? The novel is about so much more than this single character. Now, what setting has always been in fiction, of course, is a backdrop within which the character operates. Here, the setting comes almost to the foreground. And what I find fascinating in this novel is that if there is dramatic tension in the novel, and I'm not sure there is, but if you understand what I mean by that? Is it character versus character? Well, no. When Rudolph and Emma come together, there's no suspense. We know how this is going to issue. There's no doubt about it. It doesn't issue in any kind of meaningful climax. If there is dramatic conflict in the novel, it seems to me, it's between Emma and her environment. The environment comes to the foreground, and it's almost a conflict of wills. But I'm falsifying when I say that, aren't I? Because Emma doesn't have the will for conflict. She's fascinating that way.
Yeah, I think the entire, I think that's a wonderful way to just have a microcosm of the entire suffocating novel, because the whole thing is suffocating. She is set up and then put down, set up and then crushed by everything in here, every person, every novel, it's like someone sitting in an awful empty room watching commercials and wanting that.
Yeah.
She doesn't want to watch the fireworks, she wants to be inside the firework when it goes off.
Yeah.
And
this is why
constant frustration for her, and the whole thing is painful. The entire thing is suffocating and painful.
It's why when Charles at the end says it was decreed by fate, so we can nod. You know, we can nod because, as you say, everything in the novel conspires for Emma's demise. Yeah.
Well, when you're talking about the environment, that's never clearer than when she and Rodolfo are watching the agricultural fair.
Oh, it's marvelous, yeah.
Because the hawkers, the announcers of whatever's going on at the time, they're echoing and even going ahead of Rodolfo and
oh yeah,
Emma
that scene is one of the great scenes in literature, and this again, if we weren't doing this course on TV, if we were into the text, you'd see that the speeches mirror one another in their commonplaces and cliches, and even as Rudolph comes closer and closer and closer to the actual seduction of Emma, the prefect is talking about manure, and you know, it's just, you know, you have to be blind not to see what he's doing in that scene. Yeah.
We're talking about setting up. I feel she sets herself up. I think it's moral destruction waiting to happen. Given that type of character, it's just bound to happen. I mean, she just is completely unsatisfied with life, and she is such a non-realist. She's an obsessive personality. I mean, she just
listen to you guys. You're all throwing out these.
Well, she doesn't know when to give up. I mean, we were talking about other novels in Tartuffe. The wife in Tartuffe was so much worldly and so much more mature. I mean, so this was an affair that she had with Rudolph, but she obsessed. She couldn't let go. And the same with Leon. I mean, I don't think she would have been happy in any relationship because it would never have fulfilled her.
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you ever known anyone like Emma Bovary? It's a hungry personality, and you can't, no matter how they're ruining themselves, you can't put that hunger and that constant striving and obsession down. It's painful to watch. It's impossible to be around, but it's a hunger for.
But it plays out an inevitable course.
It's inevitable. You can watch all kinds of destructive things, but it's just a hunger. It's like wanting to be on the dance floor.
Yeah. And I'm not sure, I want to come back to, I'm not sure when she's confronted with this crushing ennui. You know that French word ennui? It's so much better, isn't it, than boredom? You know, when she's confronted with this crushing ennui in this provincial town, what is she supposed to do? Is she supposed to say, well, I guess these are the terms of life, and I should adjust myself to them and learn to live with ennui?
Well, but wait a minute. Where is beauty in the commonplace? I mean, there are scenes, and go back to her ride with Rodolfo to this, the ultimate seduction there. They're talking about the flowers, everything is just bursting with life all around them. But this isn't anything that she sees. That's something that we see.
That's right. That's right.
And she had a garden. I mean, she did have a garden, Ada, but you're right. She didn't tend her external garden or her internal garden.
Right.
And there is something to be said. You know, you don't have to go for I don't know, where is the gold? Because it can be in the very kind of life that she might have had. Yes. And I think we see it today, too, with women and men who are looking at the soaps or watching the stars and reading the movie magazines and observing the lives of the super rich, who very few of us need to worry about. But that's the thing, and it keeps them discontented with what they have. And I think that's tragic.
Do you think, good for you, I mean, this is where I wanted the class to get, so I'm real happy to hear you talking about this, because you have very nicely just articulated why we continue to read this novel, and why we all can say, Madame Bovary, c'est moi.
And you can still have dreams.
Yes, indeed, yeah. But the key, I guess, is how does one learn to live without the spark of the ideal which has so formed us. And Emma is singularly incapable of giving up that dream of the ideal. And what's particularly crushing for Emma is that dream of the ideal is so cliched. It's so stereotypical. Yeah.
I don't see Emma as being a person who has any sense, though she dreams, of any sense of how to reach out in reality to grab anything she dreams about. Because even when she sets herself up to use her husband's money to steal away to Lyon in the big city where she has a chance to take music lessons, and I mean, and the money that's invested in her, I could have imagined doing all kinds of things with that money besides laying up in a hotel room with a lover. You know what I'm saying? If I'm so bored and this world that I'm in is so provincial and beneath me, an opportunity to go to Paris on a weekly basis with this huge amount of my husband's fortune is an opportunity to me, you know.
Yeah. Well,
and I don't see her as being capable of doing. She took her provincialness with her to the city.
Well, of course.
She is not capable of rising above where she is. She doesn't have any tools.
No, and in that sense, she was actually best off right where she was.
Yeah, let me.
I'm outraged.
Okay, good, yeah.
I'm shocked. Could we can't judge Emma by, she should be happy with her little garden, and she should be happy, or she shouldn't choose this lover or group of lovers or whoever she chooses. You can't put one can't put one's own dreams on someone else. She is a complete tragic figure. She will not be happy, but she's still striving for what she wants. And how could we ever presume to destroy what someone else wants, or say they shouldn't strive for X, Y, or Z?
I don't think. I didn't say she shouldn't. I just say I don't think she can do it. I mean, I didn't see any evidence of her ability to do that. That's all. Not that she shouldn't.
You can't say she doesn't have any sense. She has a sense of what she wants, but she can't imagine it. She can't picture it. She can only follow this compulsion.
And be careful of too quickly judging those who do not achieve their dreams, even if you don't endorse the dreams, because. You guys have fallen short a few times on that one?
I'm just saying that she doesn't have the tools to even reach out. I'm not judging whether she has dreams or not, or even the nature of her wants. I'm not addressed that. I'm just saying that she doesn't have her personal garden is in such array. Even if she wanted to reach out, she doesn't have the tools with it to make the changes that might have made her story turn out. And
this is definitely one of the centers of the novel, is that the orthodoxy. So I've used that word so often, this term. Let's use Emma's mindset as a kind of orthodoxy, a kind of romantic orthodoxy, keeps people from experiencing life.
Yes.
It becomes a filter through which they observe both their setting and their fellow person, and it keeps them locked in the prison of that orthodoxy. And it seems what Flaubert is suggesting here is that orthodoxy can suffocate you as it does for Emma. And we're out of time on this hour. That went fast. That was a lively last few minutes, and we'll pick it up next hour. Keep your energy level high.